Hello everyone. In this video we're going to discuss chapter 12 from the textbook, which is looking at objectives, strategies, and introducing us to the ideas of developing tactics to pursue those strategies. Tactics specifically will be covered in chapter 13. We'll get there, don't worry. But right now we want to take a nice long in-depth look at what a strategy is and how we develop one. So first let's remember the key steps of a health communication plan. In developing an intervention like we're talking about for our final project in this class. We have the key steps of a health communication campaign, are developing an overall program goal, considering behavioral, social, and organizational objectives, then doing a situational and audience analysis. We've done all that in the previous videos and with our proposal stage. We have also thought about communication objectives and strategies, or at least introduced that idea. So in the proposal stage, I asked you to think of some possible approaches to this. And again, you're not married to any of those, but we want to start thinking about them more concretely. This is the next step, getting into those communication objectives and strategies to pursue those specific objectives. These are not the same as the organizational and behavioral and social objectives. We're getting a little bit more specific in terms of considering what we think the audience actually needs and how we're going to accomplish those things. So what is a communication objective compared to, say, a program objective or the objective outcome? Well, a communication objective should describe an intermediate step that must be taken in order to reach the overall program goal and outcome objective. So we could look at our previous example I used in the planning video talking about reducing the morbidity of COVID-19, right? That's a broad goal, and there's a lot of people that are affected by this. So what would be our objective there? Well, to reduce morbidity, we probably have to decrease transmission, right? Because we're talking about the incidence of this thing, and we want to have fewer people catching it, right? That would be reducing morbidity. So what is a communication objective that might help us reach that goal? Well, it kind of depends on what we're overall trying to accomplish. So in order to decrease transmission, we have to have a research-based approach to this and figure out, well, what's going to work best? There have been a lot of ideas floated, whether it's masking, vaccination, social distancing. But as based on our knowledge of respiratory airborne illnesses, spread by aerosolized particles in enclosed spaces, maybe we could start with something simple like social distancing or staying home when you're sick. There's an idea. Simple. But if people are confused by the information and the dynamics of how transmission occurs, that may not happen. We also want to be realistic in our objectives, right? We could think about our SMART criteria again here in terms of, even for the communication objectives, what are we trying to accomplish? So, well, social distancing, rather than having like full lockdowns and all this stuff that's completely unrealistic and unenforceable, maybe just encouraging people to stay home sick would be a great way to go about this. But in order to do that, in order to encourage the desired behavior, we have to communicate certain things to the audience. That's our communication objective. So in this case, we'd be perhaps trying to increase the understanding of viral transmission dynamics by a certain percent, a certain number of people perhaps, in a certain amount of time. So maybe we want to target certain groups, the most socially active groups. Perhaps we want to target college students as a key group here and say, hey, if you're sick, stay home because this virus spreads in whatever way. But we would want to have some comm objectives in terms of ways that we can evaluate whether or not we're reaching that audience with that particular message. So we want to have a concrete measurement for how to do that, and we want to have a concrete time frame to do that. So, but this is hopefully helping you understand at least that we're talking about something fairly specific. The goal here, the objective related to communication, is to increase the understanding of transmission dynamics in a certain population at a certain time. That's about the level we're looking at here. Additionally, achieving this step, right, if just skipping ahead a tiny bit towards the evaluation plan, achieving these intermediate steps can be a kind of intermediate evaluation, right? Making sure you're on the right track. So if you're concrete enough about your objectives, you should be able to know and evaluate whether or not your plan is going in the right direction. This is kind of the purpose of thinking about these communication objectives this specifically. So hopefully we can do this. Let's talk about some ways in which we can do so effectively. So the communication objectives should relate to changes in knowledge, attitudes, skills, interactions, etc. among the primary and secondary audiences. We've identified our primary and secondary audiences perhaps through the audience analysis, the situational analysis. We know who we're trying to reach. Now we're trying to consider, well, what is the objective that we're trying to get in there? What is the knowledge, attitude, skill, interaction, whatever it is that we can change here? And it's going to be directly related to those outcome objectives, right? These are intermediate changes in the social and political environment that may lead to political or social change and outcomes. So trying to think about what are these mechanisms of action that we can actually leverage to influence the situation. We may want to have these related to our program milestones. So depending on the complexity of your program, you might have more or less milestones in here. Because again, the more specific and concrete we get in terms of what we're actually trying to accomplish, the more we can break our big overarching goals into tangible steps. So for example here, maybe we want to reach a certain number of project partners within a certain time frame. We're getting more in this real world, what are we trying to do at any given time side of the planning. Now, above all else, the communication objectives need to be supportive of the overall program goal and outcome objectives. So if they're not, at any point, if our communication objectives don't match up with that goal, we might need to revisit our plan and make sure that we are, in fact, doing what we're trying to do. That's easy to overlook when you're caught up in the business of getting things done and like, all right, here we go, momentum going in this direction. But without a concrete plan and without those objectives being supportive of the goal, we're just not going to accomplish what we're trying to accomplish. Let's look at some examples. So if an objective is, for instance, to raise awareness about a certain issue, right? We think that we want to decrease the morbidity of a thing. In order to do that, we need to decrease the transmission of the certain thing. In order to do that, we need to raise awareness about the transmission dynamics of the given virus and what does and doesn't work. So we got to raise awareness. That's our communication objective. So for instance, increase awareness of HIV preventative measures and services among, say, 30% of US teens by the year 2006. That sounds really specific, doesn't it? That's because it is. And it's about as specific as you can get without considering how you're going to do that yet, right? So once you get to the point where you're like, okay, how am I going to do that? Maybe that's a good indication that you're really at those communication objectives level, right? We got to think it all the way through to what do I want to do? What am I going to accomplish? And then the next step will be the how. That's the strategy. Here's another example. To change attitudes. For instance, informing adolescents about the link between risk behaviors, specifically recreational drug use, with life-threatening accidents and disability. And we have some measurable outcome of maybe 25% by 2010, right? And later on, we have to think about the tactics of how we measure these things and establish those things. But for now, we do want to be this specific. So again, we're bumping right up against that. Well, how would you know if you've reached 25% by 2010? That's going to be the tactics side of things, but we do want to be the specific. We want to change attitudes. Recreational drug use, it contributes to life-threatening accidents and disability, which in your age group, specifically, well, in college age groups, that is the number one cause of death, is accident and disability death due to accident, which could be recreational drugs, alcohol, whatever. So again, trying to target adolescents perhaps before they get to that point so that they can avoid those risky behaviors and improve outcomes later on. How? That's the next step. So perhaps here's another one, is to help build expertise and skills, right? So, okay, if that is our communication objective, it's very nice and measurable and precise. So, well, we do want to get even more precise and say who is going to do what and when, or by when. So we want to help build expertise and skills. We want to increase the number of teens who know how to perform CPR by maybe 50% by the end of the school year, or whatever it may be. These should be that concrete. We're not dealing with the strategy and tactics just yet, but we really want to be taking our thinking out of the abstract and into the realm of the concrete. So these communication objectives should be discussing who should do what and when should they do it by. Remember the textbook's discussion of the SMART objectives, which we'll get into in a moment. Here's another example. To break the cycle of misinformation. Maybe we want to have 80%, 85% of those measured in adolescents to understand the importance of proper application of antibiotics. Again, fairly specific, concrete, who's doing what and when. So let's discuss, now that I've given you some examples, we're kind of going to take a step back and think about ways in which we can develop communication objectives. So here's some things that we can do as we're trying to noodle in our heads what we're trying to accomplish specifically. So number one, we could review, share, and discuss our research findings. Most of these health communication plans, with the exception of you're doing an individual group project, they're not done individually. Even in your group project, you can and should discuss with me and your peers, right? Review, share, and discuss your research findings, because everything you do should be research-based. And the best way to better understand your research and how to apply it is by talking to other people. Now, you also want to make sure that your objectives are specific to each group and stakeholder. I can say this over and over and over again, but all our messaging should be audience-centered. We also need to identify and prioritize the objectives. There may be more than one objective, maybe 2 to 3 per audience. Don't go crazy. The more you have, the more messages you have that are just going to be kind of schizophrenic, and you're not going to be able to put the energy you need to into addressing certain people. So identify and prioritize your objectives, and don't do too many. Don't do more than 2 or 3 per audience. So if we've got a primary audience, a secondary audience, our objectives should be no more than 6, right? Let's just only bite off as much as we can chew. And we also want to prioritize those. Those shouldn't all be equal importance, right? We have to prioritize things so that we know how to proceed. And again, we want to ask ourselves very practical questions at this point. Who will be doing what and by when, and ideally, how much? We want to ask and answer those questions in the process of this health program, and that can help us evaluate the success of the program. We also don't want to be including what we refer to as tactical elements at this stage. That is going to get a little too complicated if we are trying to do that right now. It's tempting. It's very, very hard not to do this, actually. But you really need to focus on the communication objective stage in terms of what do you want them to do and how and by how much and all of that. Those questions we need to answer now. However, the what am I going to do to get them to do that, that can come later, because there's always a lot of possibilities. Visually, if you want to imagine how this works, right? We've got our problem goal, and then that kind of branches off into, well, what are the objectives? How do we reach that? And well, okay, well, how do we achieve those objectives? And then, well, how do I achieve those objectives? And the farther down this branching structure we get, the more complicated it's going to get. So we want to make sure that at each intermediate step, we are following this kind of flow chart towards a specific goal, and the tactical elements will come last. So as we make these decisions, as we're picking our path along this giant cosmic flow chart or whatever it is, we do need to consider the practicalities. That's why I mention it at pretty much every step here, right? We need to think about the barriers that get in the way of achieving these objectives. We need to think about time frames. We need to be realistic. We always have to be realistic about these things. And in doing so, that will help us get to the tactical elements of, am I distributing a pamphlet on Tuesday, right? Those are the tactical elements that we'll get to later on. So as always, we want to revisit our outcome objectives, and we can use the SMART criteria again for developing these objectives, whether they are the outcome objectives or whether they are the communication objectives. As a basic reminder, SMART means specific. That's the who should be doing what when. Is it measurable, right? If we can't answer the when and by how much, it's not a good objective. We have to be more specific than that. If it is not appropriate to the audience, That's a problem too, because at this stage, we're definitely thinking about different objectives for different audiences, and that depends on their different needs. Is it realistic? I will continue to say this at every possible opportunity, because the easiest mistake to make is be like, well, we'll just solve this problem by enacting another law. Okay, well, first of all, laws almost never solve the problem, definitely not on their own, and it's not very realistic to expect them to solve the problem, right? Time bound, again, by when? This is part of being measurable and realistic and appropriate and all of that, but we want to ask ourselves these questions, and if we can't answer those questions, then we need to revisit our objectives. Now, I'm throwing a lot of vocabulary words around now, so let's see if we can break this down a little bit. We want to distinguish between objectives, goals, strategy, and tactics. What are these different things? So we've spent a lot of time thinking about the overarching program goal. That's probably the easiest part for you to consider. Is like, what am I trying to do with this program? I want to reduce smoking in this group. I want to reduce the occurrence of STIs in this group. I want to improve hygiene in the dorms. Whatever it is you guys are deciding to do, that's fine. That's your overall goal. However, to get to that goal, we have to do a lot of other things. So objectives describe what will be accomplished, whether that's the objective outcome or the communication outcomes. These are separate things. The strategy answers how the objective will be accomplished. What will you do to reach that objective, which will support the program goal? And tactical elements are smaller. Those are the individual actions that you will take to enact the strategy. That's the, I'm going to use pamphlets, I'm going to hold a workshop, I'm going to, and then even sub-tactical elements, right? I'm going to call my senator first. I'm going to call this coordinator to see if they'll do a workshop, right? Those are all tactical elements. And we'll get to that in terms of enacting the plan. But for now, I want to make sure that we are clear that all of these are different components. Some of them are smaller, some of them are bigger. They're all interrelated, and hopefully we can make better sense of that. But as always, every single one of these things should be audience centered. So that's why there's so many possibilities, because there's so many people, there's so many possible audiences, there's so many ways to affect problems. But whatever we do, we need to consider the needs, preferences, the hobbies, the channels, the preferred messengers, the culture. All of these things have to be considered to have a successful plan. You don't have to go full infinite regress and dive down the rabbit hole and never come back out again. But if you're doing anything without thinking about its possible effects, or its most likely effect, that's a problem. And how you can then adjust that effect. Well, maybe I can influence it one way or another. This also speaks to the idea of positioning, which the textbook mentions. Compare this to like framing, right? So how are you going to situate your message in relation to your key group members, your audience members, and specifically what they need from you, what they want from you. So if you cannot consider those needs and wants, you will not be successful. Bummer. Maybe this image can help you sort this out a little bit. I'm talking about a flow chart and all that, but maybe I can help you by visualizing this a little bit. So the first thing you'll see is, contrary to how I was describing it, all of this, I've got my arrows here indicating that it all feeds up into that program goal. That's the overarching thing. However, in terms of the planning, we might just flip the arrows the other way, because first we're thinking about a program goal. Then we go from that program goal, all right, this is what I want to accomplish. Okay, what are some possible outcome objectives that I could pursue to accomplish that goal? Well, I could reduce morbidity, or I could reduce mortality. Maybe those are my outcome objectives. Okay, well, let's take it down another step. What are some ways I could reach those goals? Well, maybe that's speaking to our strategy a little bit. And maybe we'll come back into those possible strategies later on. Maybe we decide early on, okay, well, I want to focus on adolescents and stop them from smoking early on. Maybe that's kind of describing the overall strategy. Still don't know the how yet, but maybe that's describing it. But it is also going to be contingent on these communication objectives. Okay, so in order to get adolescents to stop smoking early, to reduce the morbidity of smoking, well, maybe I need to consider my communication objectives, which is to reach them through social media, to reach them through a campaign of pamphlets, or maybe I want to improve their awareness. Well, maybe I do that by having YouTube videos or talking to them, guest speakers, right? So, and that's one possible strategy. All right, there are whole other strategies, there are other communication objectives. Some of them may be more or less important. Do I think it's more important to improve their awareness? Do I think it's more important to improve their understanding of the health effects? Well, that's up to you. And ultimately, your health campaign may look something like, okay, I am going to pursue this tactic. And that is what my campaign is leveraging, because I know that this tactic is going to support this really important outcome. And that important outcome is going to support this really important strategy. And that strategy is going to pursue this objective outcome. And that objective outcome has the highest likelihood of reaching my program goal. So maybe this helps us understand a little bit more, at least visualize what these different terms mean. And it can help us understand that this is, in fact, an iterative process that requires understanding, engagement, evaluation at pretty much every step, right? We're not down to the tactics yet, but it's really hard to figure out those tactics until you understand all of these bigger things up above. I hope that helps a little bit. Maybe it'll help if we can look at a concrete example. So let's think about the development of a strategy. Okay, well, let's start with a program goal. We want to reduce the impact of back-to-back pregnancies on family income, childcare quality, overall quality of life among women between 18 to 29. Wow, what a specific program goal. That's great. Seems like it's fairly realistic. It seems like something that could possibly be achieved by a health campaign. Okay, that's a goal though. It says nothing about how that's going to be accomplished or what needs to be done to accomplish it. So, in order to reach that goal, what's the behavioral objective? Well, it seems like the best thing we could do based on the research, based on what we know about family planning, is to encourage women in this age group, 18 to 29, to use short-term family planning methods to space their pregnancies at least 1 year apart. Then hey, that's a great milestone, right? First program milestone to be achieved after 18 months from launch is seeing if we can measure that kind of effect. Have we reduced or rather, have we increased the amount of time spent between pregnancies? Because again, our goal here is to reduce back-to-back pregnancies for a specific group. Okay. Okay, well, in order to reach that behavioral objective, what are some communication objectives we could pursue? We could facilitate patient-provider communications on short-term family planning in whatever % of medical practices by whatever year, right? That's nice and concrete. Again, we can use our SMART criteria. Specific, who's doing it? Well, we're working on the patient-provider communications. Who's doing what? Hopefully we're getting them to talk to each other a bit more. When are they doing it? Is this realistic? Well, we can answer all these questions, right? And we're getting a lot of that concrete, who does what, when, where, how, and by how much, right? That's how specific we're going to be. Another communication objective would be, well, maybe we, rather than facilitate patient-provider communication, we're going to increase awareness. And here's all the accompanying things, but we should, regardless of the communication objective, we should be this specific. We should be this concrete. Now, you guys, for your final projects, this is as far as I expect you to take it. I would like you to have some ideas as to how you could measure that. And you'll have to explain that a little bit in your projects, but you're not going to have to do it. You're not going to have to enact the program and like actually evaluate it. But our projects should probably be this focused, right? This is what I want to do. Here's how I'm going to measure that objective by this much increase by this year, whatever it may be in this group. And then we move on to the health plan, and you guys can start making an actual product, whether it's a YouTube video or a pamphlet or whatever it may be. Now, again, the strategy development versus the tactics. The strategy is to promote short-term FP methods, family planning methods, as well as their safety and efficacy through healthcare providers counseling. Okay, maybe that's the strategy I've decided. There's multiple strategies that we could enact to pursue this goal and these objectives, right? But this is one. Maybe we pick this one. All right, I'm really going to focus on the healthcare providers and counsel them to promote family planning, the short-term family planning methods, okay? All right, what are some tactics we can do that? Well, if we're reaching the healthcare providers, then we could have patient-provider workshops at local health clinics. Well, now we're getting there, right? Now we know what to do. We got to call the clinic, set up the workshop so we can get the family planning providers in there to talk to patients and everyone can learn. Some other tactics, we could conduct media outreach to publicize the workshop, do calendar, encourage women's attendance and promote awareness of short-term FP methods, right? These are specific concrete tactics that we can use to pursue these goals. We could also develop educational tools that could be used by providers for new patient orientation sessions. We could create an online listserv where healthcare providers can share resources. Or we could just go take the subreddit for doctors who are into this kind of thing and put it on Facebook, whatever it may be. There's a lot of different ways that we can reach our goals, but we need to be specific enough to think about what these tactics are going to be. But as we mentioned, there's more than one way to skin a cat, as it were. So a different strategy would be to focus on developing a social network for these particular women in a target community, and have get advocates who can talk about how successful this was for them, right? So training women becomes a tactic, conducting outreach becomes a tactic, developing public service announcements becomes a tactic, organizing internet chats. The tactics are subservient to the strategy. Now, there's always multiple strategies, and it's going to be up to you, based on your research, which strategy you pick that's going to be most useful in the pursuit of these goals. So as you can see, there's a lot of possibilities and we have to sort through them individually. This may be a little bit overwhelming or seem a little bit overwhelming, but it's not doing anything different than what you're already doing in terms of thinking about your project. And I'm sure you can feel overwhelmed when you start thinking about your project as well. This is designed to help you do that more effectively and not be so freaked out by it, right? As soon as we start recognizing the complexity of problems, we recognize that there are so many possible paths that we can choose. And in order to do that, we have to have realistic, measurable outcomes. And using these kinds of criteria, even if you take nothing else away from this than the SMART criteria, doing that gives you some footing. It gives you something to stand on while you're trying to solve these problems. Otherwise, you're just in this dark sea of possibilities, and we have to start getting realistic in order to reach our goals. And that is what health message advocacy and program planning is all about. So the next steps, we will focus on concrete action steps and how to develop those tactics unique to your strategy, unique to your goals, unique to your objectives, unique to your program goals. And that will be the focus of the action plan in upcoming chapters. But for now, think about strategy, think about possibility, and try to let that excite you rather than deter you. I hope you found this video useful. If you have any questions, as always, feel free to reach out to me. I'm always around and looking forward to hearing from you. Thanks. Have a good one.